How do you give birth to 3 kings and still die being called a serpent? How do you command a fortune large enough to fund armies but never be allowed to own a single coin in your own name? What does it feel like to know your marriage was traded for a political favor before you could even write your own name? Your whole life is a performance, your every move judged. Your duty is to produce a son, and if you fail, you are disposable. This was the world of a Medici woman. It was a gilded cage, and the rules for survival were nearly impossible to follow. Number 15, can you secure the future? Anna Maria Luisa de Medici was the last of her line. The year was 1737. She was a widow, childless, living in the Pitti Palace in Florence. The Grand Ducal line of the Medici, which had dominated Florence and Tuscany for over 300 years, was about to end with her. Her brother, the last male Medici Grand Duke, had died. The great powers of Europe had already decided Tuscany's fate. It was to be handed over to Francis Stephen of Lorraine. A foreigner would rule in the city of the Medici. Everything her family had built, collected, and fought for was about to be scattered to the winds. The vast art collections, the sculptures, the libraries, the jewels. They would be sold off, shipped to Vienna, or used to pay foreign debts. This was the final test for a Medici woman. It was not about producing an heir or making a good marriage or advising a son. It was about what happens when all that is over. What do you do when you are the only one left to guard the legacy? The rule was simple and absolute: secure the family's future. But her family had no future. The bloodline was at an end. So Anna Maria Luisa did something remarkable. She redefined the rule. If she couldn't secure the family's blood, she would secure its soul. She spent months negotiating with the new Lorraine rulers. They were powerful. She was, on paper, a relic, a 70-year-old woman with no army and no heir, but she had one thing they did not. She had the legal and moral ownership of the entire Medici patrimony. Everything in the Uffizi, the Pitti Palace, the Medici villas. It was all technically her private property, inherited from her brother. She could have sold it. She could have hidden it. She could have used it to live out her days in unimaginable luxury. Instead, she created a legal document. It became known as the Patto di Famiglia, the family pact. It was signed on October 31st, 1737. The terms were simple. She would donate every single piece of the Medici collection to the new Grand Duchy of Tuscany. But there was a condition so strict and so forward-thinking, it is almost hard to believe. Nothing could ever be removed from Florence. The collections had to remain intact forever for the benefit of the public and to attract foreigners. She didn't just give the art away. She chained it to the city. She made it impossible for the new rulers or any rulers who came after them to treat the Medici legacy as their personal treasure chest. It was now the property of the world, but it had to be viewed in Florence. She ensured that the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and all the other collections would remain as they were. She saved the heritage of the Renaissance. Think about the pressure. The end of a dynasty, the arrival of foreign rulers, the temptation to take what was yours and run. She resisted all of it. This final act was perhaps the most Medici act of all. It was not about personal gain. It was about cementing the family name in history. She understood that the Medici power was no longer in banking or in ruling. It was in culture. It was in the art that her family had commissioned and collected. By giving it away under her strict terms, she ensured that the name Medici would be synonymous with Florence forever. She secured a future not of blood but of legacy. This was the impossible final rule, and she was the only one who could have followed it. And she did. Number 14, can you outmaneuver a king? Marie de Medici's personal treasury, upon arriving in France in 1600, was over 600,000 crowns, a sum so large it was used to pay off the French king's debts to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. She was married by proxy in Florence, with the king not even bothering to show up. When she became regent of France after her husband's assassination, one of her first acts was to commission a series of 24 massive paintings from Peter Paul Rubens depicting her own life in grandiose mythological terms. It was a public relations campaign on an epic scale. The rule for a Medici woman who became a queen was this: you advise, you influence, you give birth to the next king. But you do not rule, and you certainly do not challenge your own son once he is king. Marie de Medici broke that rule completely. Her life was a constant struggle for power, first with her husband's ministers and then disastrously with her own son, King Louis. When King Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, their son Louis was only 8 years old. Marie became regent. For 7 years, she was the most powerful person in France. She dismissed her husband's trusted advisors. She promoted her own favorites, particularly the Italian Concino Concini and his wife. This was her first mistake. The French nobility hated them. They saw them as foreign upstarts who were draining the French treasury. But Marie trusted them. They were loyal to her, not to the French state. Her second mistake was underestimating her son. As Louis grew into a teenager, he resented his mother's control. He resented Concini. He wanted to be a real king, not a puppet. In 1617, with the help of his own advisors, the 15-year-old Louis staged a coup. He ordered the assassination of Concini, who was shot dead on the drawbridge of the Louvre. He had Concini's wife executed for witchcraft, and he exiled his own mother to the Chateau de Blois. This is where another woman might have accepted defeat. She was the queen mother, but her son was the king. The power had shifted. But Marie was a Medici. She did not accept defeat. In 1619, she escaped from her castle prison. She slid down a rope ladder at night, a stout, middle-aged woman making a daring escape to rally her supporters. She raised an army and waged a civil war against her own son. She lost. He forgave her. She was, after all, his mother. And for a time they reconciled. She returned to the court. She even managed to get her own protege, a brilliant churchman named Cardinal Richelieu, appointed to the King's Council. This was her third and final mistake. She thought Richelieu would be loyal to her. She thought he was her man. She was wrong. Richelieu was loyal to one thing, the power of the French crown, and by extension the king. Richelieu quickly became the king's most trusted advisor. He saw Marie's constant plotting and her pro-Spanish foreign policy as a threat to France. The final showdown came on a single day in November 1630, known as the Day of the Dupes. Marie confronted her son. She demanded he choose between her and Richelieu. She thought she had won. The king seemed to agree. Richelieu's political career looked over. But overnight, Louis had a change of heart. He met with Richelieu in secret and confirmed his trust in him. When Marie woke up, she was the one who was out. The king ordered her to leave Paris. She was exiled again. This time there was no coming back. She fled to Brussels, then London, then Cologne. She spent the last decade of her life as a wanderer, a queen in exile, constantly writing letters, trying to plot her return. She died in 1642 in a house owned by the painter Rubens, the same artist she had hired to immortalize her glory. And she died poor, her vast fortune gone, her political power shattered. She had tried to outmaneuver a king, her own son. And in the end, she lost everything. The rule was impossible because it went against her nature. She was raised to believe in the power of her family. But in the cold logic of monarchy, the king's power was absolute, even over the mother who gave him the crown. Number 13, can you please a city that hates you? Clarice Orsini was not from Florence. She was from Rome. She was a member of one of the oldest, most powerful noble families in Italy. The Orsini were soldiers and cardinals, not bankers and merchants. When she was betrothed to Lorenzo de Medici in 1469, it was a major social coup for the Medici. They were marrying into the high aristocracy, but for Florence, it was an insult. The Medici, the city's leading family, had chosen a foreigner. The rule for a Medici wife was to be the heart of the Florentine home. You were expected to understand the city's complex social rules, its gossip, its politics. You had to be one of them. For Clarice, this was impossible from the start. She arrived in Florence a stranger, and in many ways she remained one. The Florentines found her cold They were used to the more accessible, friendly style of Medici women, like Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Lorenzo's mother. Clarice was formal, pious, and held herself with an aristocratic reserve that a city proud of its Republican roots read as arrogance. Her letters are full of complaints. She disliked the food. She was homesick for Rome. She did not understand the way Florentine politics worked, where influence was subtle and based on relationships, not on formal titles. Lorenzo's mother, Lucrezia, tried to guide her. In her letters, you can see her coaching Clarice on how to behave, who to talk to, how to manage the household. But there was a fundamental clash of cultures. When Lorenzo was away, Clarice was expected to manage the Medici household and its vast network of clients and supporters. People would come to the Medici palace for favors, for advice, for financial help. This was the source of Medici power. Clarice, used to the Roman system of formal hierarchy, was often blunt and dismissive. She did not have the soft touch needed for this kind of retail politics. There are stories of her turning away people that Lorenzo's mother would have helped. She caused offense without meaning to. She wrote to her husband complaining about the constant stream of people and the demands on her time. She didn't see it as the foundation of their family's power. She saw it as an annoyance. Her relationship with Lorenzo himself was complicated. It was a political match, not a love match. Lorenzo had a long-term mistress and wrote love poetry to other women. This was not unusual for the time, but it highlighted the distance between them. Clarice's focus was on her children and her religion. She was a devoted mother, but even here, her choices caused friction. She clashed with the famous humanist scholar Poliziano, whom Lorenzo had hired to tutor their sons. She thought his focus on classical literature was pagan and unsuitable. She wanted a more traditional religious education for her boys. This led to a major argument, and Poliziano was temporarily dismissed. It was a struggle for the soul of the next generation of Medici, and Clarice was on the side of old-world Roman piety, not Florentine Renaissance humanism. She never truly won the hearts of the Florentines. They respected her as Lorenzo's wife and the mother of his children, but they never loved her. She was a constant reminder that the Medici were becoming something different. They were moving away from being the first family of a republic and toward being a princely dynasty. Her aristocratic background, which was the very reason for the marriage, was also the reason she could never truly fit in. She was a living symbol of the Medici's ambition, and for a city that was deeply suspicious of anyone with too much power, that made her an object of suspicion herself. The rule was to be a woman of Florence, but Clarice Orsini was, and always remained, a woman of Rome. She could not please a city that was determined not to be pleased by her. Number 12, can you survive your own children? Catherine de Medici had 10 children. 7 of them survived to adulthood. 3 of them became kings of France. One became a queen. It sounds like the ultimate success for a royal mother. Her primary duty was to provide heirs for the Valois dynasty, and she had provided them in abundance. But the rule for a Medici woman was not just to have children. It was to ensure they carried the family's legacy forward. For Catherine, this meant ensuring they held onto the French throne. This rule became a source of unimaginable grief and a lifelong desperate struggle. Her children were not strong. They were plagued by illness, and they became kings at a time when France was tearing itself apart with religious wars. Her first son to become king, Francis II, was a sickly teenager. He was married to Mary, Queen of Scots. He ruled for just over a year before dying from an ear infection at the age of 16. Catherine was suddenly regent for her second son, Charles the Nix, who was only 10 years old. She spent the next decade trying to guide Charles, trying to maintain peace between the Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots. But Charles was weak-willed and prone to fits of rage. He was easily influenced by the powerful noble factions at court. The pressure on him was immense. This all came to a head in August 1572 with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The event, a targeted assassination of Huguenot leaders, spiraled into a city-wide slaughter. Historians still debate Catherine's exact role. Did she order it? Did she approve of it, or did she lose control of a situation that she helped create? Whatever the truth, it happened under her son's reign. Charles never recovered from the guilt and the horror. He is said to have screamed about the bloodshed on his deathbed. He died less than 2 years later at the age of 23, likely from tuberculosis. One son dead in his teens, another dead in his early 20s, haunted and broken. Now her third son, Henry III, became king. And Henry was her favorite. He was intelligent, charming, and artistic, but he was also deeply unpopular. He had no children of his own. The heir to the throne was a distant cousin, the Protestant Henry of Navarre. This was unacceptable to the powerful Catholic League, who waged war against the king. France plunged deeper into civil war. Catherine spent her final years in a frantic race against time, trying to broker a peace, trying to secure the throne for her son, trying to find a way to produce another heir. She died in January 1589. She was 69 years old, exhausted by decades of political struggle. She did not live to see the final tragedy. Just 7 months after her death, her beloved son, King Henry III, was assassinated by a fanatical monk. Her last son was gone. The Valois dynasty was extinct. The throne passed to his Protestant rival, Henry of Navarre, who became King Henry IV. She had given birth to 3 kings, and she had outlived them all, except for Henry, who died just months after her. Her only surviving child was her daughter, Marguerite, whose own marriage to Henry of Navarre had been the trigger for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Catherine had dedicated her entire life to her children and to securing their power, and she had failed. They had died young, they had left no heirs, and they had presided over one of the bloodiest periods in French history. She survived them, but their failures were her failures, their deaths were the end of her life's work. The impossible rule was to see your children succeed, to see them build upon your efforts. Catherine's tragedy was that she lived long enough to watch everything she had built for them crumble into dust. At number 11, can you command an army? Caterina Sforza was not a Medici by birth, but she married one, and her life story shows what happened when a woman with Medici connections decided that the rules did not apply to her. She was the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Milan, married off at 14 to Girolamo Riario, the Lord of Imola and Forli, and a nephew of the Pope. She was known throughout Italy for her beauty, but also for her ferocity. Her nickname was the Tigress of Forli. The unwritten rule for a Medici woman was to use influence, not force. You schemed in palaces, you wrote letters, you arranged marriages. You did not put on armor and lead soldiers. Caterina Sforza ignored this rule. She lived by her own. Her first major test came in 1484. The Pope, her husband's uncle and patron, died. This was a disaster. Without papal protection, their hold on their lands was weak. Rome descended into chaos. Her husband, Girolamo, was with his troops outside the city. And Caterina was 7 months pregnant. Instead of fleeing or waiting for her husband, she took action. She got on a horse, rode to Rome, and seized the Castel Sant'Angelo, the papal fortress. She aimed its cannons at the Vatican and refused to leave until the College of Cardinals guaranteed that her husband would keep his lands and be paid what he was owed. The cardinals, terrified of this armed, pregnant woman holding the key to the city, gave in. She was 21 years old. This was just the beginning. In 1488, her husband was assassinated in a coup in their own city of Forli. Caterina and her 6 children were taken prisoner. The conspirators brought her to the walls of the Rocca di Ravaldino, the city's fortress, which was still held by a loyal Castellan. They threatened to kill her children if she did not order the fortress to surrender. What happened next is a legend. The details are likely exaggerated, but the spirit of the story is pure Caterina. According to the chroniclers, she asked for permission to enter the fortress to persuade the Castellan to surrender. The conspirators, thinking she would do as they said, agreed, but they kept her children as hostages. Once inside, Caterina went to the battlements, raised her skirts to her captors below, and shouted that she had the means to make more children. She refused to surrender. She dared them to kill her children. The conspirators were so shocked by her defiance that they lost their nerve. They did not harm the children. Eventually, with help from her uncle in Milan, Caterina's forces retook the city. She had her revenge on the conspirators. She ruled Forli and Imola for the next decade as regent for her son. She married twice more, both times for love and political alliance. She studied alchemy and botany, creating recipes for cosmetics and medicines. She was a true Renaissance ruler, interested in everything. But her final battle was against a foe she could not defeat, Cesare Borgia. In 1499, Cesare, the son of Pope Alexander VI, began his campaign to carve out a state for himself in central Italy with the backing of the French army. He came for Caterina's lands. One by one, her towns fell. She refused all offers of surrender. She retreated to the fortress of Forli for a final stand. She personally commanded the defense, directing cannon fire and organizing supplies. The siege was brutal. Cesare Borgia's artillery eventually breached the walls. After a desperate last stand, she was captured in January 1500. She was taken to Rome as a prisoner. Even in defeat, she was defiant. She tried to escape. She was eventually freed and retired to a villa in Florence. Her son, from her second marriage, would become a famous condottiero, a mercenary captain known as Giovanni dalle Bandiere. And his son, in turn, would be Cosimo de Medici, the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. Caterina Sforza's defiant bloodline would end up creating the new ruling dynasty of Florence. She broke the rule about women not using force. She proved that a woman could command an army, could rule a state, and could be just as ruthless and brave as any man. Her life was an exception, a brilliant, violent flash that illuminated the very rules she refused to follow. Number 10, can you be smarter than your husband? Lucrezia Tornabuoni was born into a prominent Florentine family, but her marriage to Piero de Medici, son of Cosimo the Elder, placed her at the very center of Medici power. Piero was intelligent and capable, but he was plagued by severe gout, which often left him bedridden. He was known as Piero the Gouty. This physical limitation meant that he had to rely heavily on others. And the person he relied on most was his wife. The rule for a Medici wife was to be a supportive partner, to manage the home, and to raise the children. It was not to be the family's secret political weapon, but that is exactly what Lucrezia became. The unwritten sub-rule was that you could be smart, you could be educated, but you must never ever appear to be smarter than your husband or to be making the decisions. Lucrezia mastered this impossible balancing act. She was a highly educated woman. She wrote poetry, plays, and sacred texts. She was a major patron of the arts, commissioning works from artists like Botticelli and Ghirlandaio. But her real genius was political. While Piero was confined to his rooms, Lucrezia became his eyes and ears in the city. She moved through Florence, talking to people from all walks of life. She built a vast network of contacts. She was the approachable face of the Medici regime. People wrote to her directly asking for help. Her letters show the incredible range of her influence. She was asked to help find jobs for people's sons, to settle business disputes, to arrange marriages, to get people out of trouble with the law. She would recommend priests for local churches. She managed the family's charitable giving, which was a crucial tool for maintaining popular support. She was, in effect, running a parallel administration out of the Medici palace. She was also a shrewd businesswoman. The Medici had business interests all over Europe. Lucrezia traveled on her own to Rome and other places, not just to visit relatives, but to check on the family's financial affairs, to negotiate loans, and to look for good investment opportunities. She bought and sold property in her own name, something that was unusual for a woman of her time. She used the profits to fund her charities and to purchase land and properties that would benefit her children. Her most important role, however, was as an advisor to her husband and later to her son, Lorenzo the Magnificent. She had a keen understanding of Florentine politics. She knew who was loyal and who was not. She understood the importance of maintaining the appearance of a private citizen, even while acting as the city's de facto ruler. It was Lucrezia who traveled to Rome to inspect the noble women available for her son Lorenzo to marry. She chose Clarice Orsini not for her beauty or charm, but for the powerful Roman family connection that she would bring to the Medici. It was a strategic political decision, and it showed her long-term thinking. She did all of this without ever taking public credit. She always deferred to her husband in public. Her letters are models of careful diplomacy. She presented her opinions as suggestions. She framed her actions as being in service to her husband and her family. She was smarter, more politically astute, and certainly more mobile than her husband, but she never let it show in a way that would challenge his authority. She was the quiet engine of Medici power during a critical period. She showed that the most effective power is sometimes the power that no one sees. The rule was to not outshine your husband, and Lucrezia followed it by building a power base so solid and so subtle that she never had to. Number 9. Can you choose your own husband? The dowry of a Medici woman was not just a wedding gift. It was a political statement. The amount of money, land, and jewels that a Medici daughter brought to a marriage was a measure of the family's wealth and power. For Catherine de Medici's marriage to the French Prince Henry, her uncle Pope Clement VII promised a dowry of 130,000 ducats, a colossal sum. It was so large that the papacy was still paying it off years later. A Medici girl did not choose a husband based on love or affection. She was a chess piece in a much larger game. The rule was simple: you will marry the man your father chooses. Your marriage will serve the family's strategic interests. It will secure an alliance, neutralize a rival, or gain a title. Your personal feelings are irrelevant. This rule was, for almost every Medici woman, utterly impossible to break. Their value to the family was precisely in their ability to be married off. From a very young age, a Medici daughter would have understood this. Her education was geared towards making her a desirable bride for a powerful man. She would learn languages, music, and courtly etiquette. She would be taught how to manage a large household, but she would also be taught that her primary loyalty was always to her birth family, the Medici. When she married into another family, she was expected to act as a Medici agent in her new home, sending back information and working to advance her family's interests. Consider the marriage of Maddalena de Medici, the daughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent. In 1487, Lorenzo arranged for her to marry Francescetto Cybo, the illegitimate son of the reigning Pope, Innocent V. The match was scandalous. Francescetto was much older, a dissolute gambler, but Lorenzo needed the Pope's support. The Pope had been an enemy of the Medici. This marriage was part of a grand bargain. In exchange for his daughter, Lorenzo secured a cardinal's hat for his 13-year-old son, Giovanni, who would later become Pope Leo X. Maddalena was only 14. She was sent to live in Rome, a city her family had often been at odds with. She was married to a man she barely knew, a man with a terrible reputation, all to secure a church promotion for her younger brother. Her feelings were not part of the calculation. Her happiness was secondary to the family's ambition. This was the cold logic of dynastic politics. A daughter was an asset to be traded. This practice started early. The Medici used marriage to solidify their power within Florence long before they were rulers. Cosimo de' Medici's wife, Contessina de' Bardi, came from a powerful old banking family that the Medici had surpassed. The marriage linked the new money of the Medici to the old respectability of the Bardi. Lorenzo's own marriage to the Roman noblewoman Clarice Orsini was designed to elevate the family status outside of Florence. There was no illusion of choice. The negotiations would happen between the fathers, sometimes when the children were still infants. The dowry would be debated. The terms of the marriage contract would be hammered out by lawyers. The bride and groom might not even meet until the wedding. To refuse such a marriage would be an unthinkable act of defiance. It would be a betrayal of one's family and duty. A woman who refused would bring shame on her house and would likely be sent to a convent, the only other respectable option for a high-born woman. The system was designed to remove personal choice entirely. Love was something that might happen after the wedding, or it might not. It was a bonus, not a requirement. The requirement was loyalty, heirs, and the fulfillment of a political contract. The impossible rule was to have a say in the most important decision of your life. For a Medici woman, that decision was never hers to make. Number 8, can you own anything? A Medici woman could be surrounded by more wealth than almost anyone else in Europe. The Medici Palace on the Via Larga in Florence was filled with priceless art, expensive furniture, and luxurious fabrics. The family vaults held a fortune in gold florins. When Catherine de Medici went to France, her trousseau included gowns of cloth of gold and velvet, chests of jewels, and even a bed made of solid silver. And yet, in a very real sense, a Medici woman owned almost nothing. The rule was this: you are the steward of the family's wealth, but not its owner. The money, the palaces, the art, it all belonged to the patrilineal, passed down from father to son. A woman's access to this wealth was entirely dependent on her relationship with the men in her family, first her father, then her husband, then her sons. This started with the dowry. A dowry was a legal transfer of wealth from the bride's family to the groom's. It was her contribution to the new household, but once paid, it was legally controlled by her husband. He could invest it, spend it, or use it to pay his debts. If the husband died, a woman was entitled to have her dowry returned from his estate. This was her main source of financial security. But while she was married, the money was not truly hers to command. We see this in the life of Contessina de Bardi, the wife of Cosimo de Medici. She was the manager of the vast Medici household. She oversaw the staff, the budgets, the purchasing of food and supplies. She was a capable administrator. But all of this was done on behalf of her husband. The palace was his. The money she spent was his. Her role was one of management, not ownership. Even a woman's personal possessions, like her clothes and jewels, were often considered part of the family's assets, not her private property. They were a reflection of her husband's or father's status. A well-dressed wife showed the world that the family was prosperous. When a woman died, her personal effects would often be passed down to her daughters or daughters-in-law. They were part of the family's treasury. There were exceptions, and clever women found ways to operate within the system. Lucrezia Tornabuoni, as we've seen, was a skilled businesswoman who bought and sold property. She did this using money from her dowry and from profits she made, creating a personal portfolio that gave her a degree of financial independence. But this was unusual. It required a supportive husband and a great deal of personal skill. And even then, it was on a much smaller scale than the main family fortune. The situation became even more stark for a Medici woman who became a queen. Marie de Medici brought an immense dowry to France. But that money was quickly absorbed into the French royal treasury. As queen and later as regent, she controlled vast state revenues, and she spent lavishly on art, palaces, and her political favorites. But when she fell from power and was exiled by her son, she discovered how precarious her position was. Her access to money was cut off. The palaces she had built, like the Luxembourg Palace in Paris, were no longer hers. She had controlled billions, but she owned nothing. She died in relative poverty. This lack of personal ownership was a fundamental source of insecurity. A woman's entire economic well-being depended on the goodwill of the men in her life. If her husband was a spendthrift, he could waste her dowry. If she did not produce a son, she could be cast aside. If she was widowed, she might have to fight with her husband's relatives to get her dowry back. The rule was that wealth was a male possession. Women were simply the conduits through which it passed from one family to another, from one generation to the next. They were surrounded by gold, but their own hands were empty. Number 7, can you raise a son to be a pope? The Medici were not just bankers and rulers of Florence. They were a dynasty that sought power on an international stage. And in Renaissance Italy, the ultimate power was the papacy. For a Medici mother, the most ambitious goal was not just to raise a son to be a duke, but to raise a son to sit on the throne of St. Peter. This was the task that fell to 2 Medici women, in particular Lucrezia Tornabuoni and Clarice Orsini. The rule was not just to raise a good son or a powerful son. It was to raise a son who could navigate the treacherous, corrupt, and deeply political world of the Roman Catholic Church. This meant an education that was part Tuscan, part Roman, and all about power. Lucrezia Tornabuoni's second son was Giovanni de Medici. From a very young age, it was clear that he was destined for the church. This was a strategic decision by his father Piero and his grandfather Cosimo. The family needed a high-ranking churchman to protect their interest in Rome. Lucrezia oversaw his early education. He was bright and learned easily, but his real education in power politics came from his family. He learned how the Medici Bank was intertwined with papal finances. He learned how to use patronage and networking to build alliances. The masterstroke came from his brother, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who used his own daughter's marriage to secure a cardinal's hat for Giovanni. At 13, Giovanni became a cardinal. It was a purely political appointment. Clarice Orsini, Lorenzo's wife and Giovanni's sister-in-law, was now tasked with continuing his preparation. As a Roman noblewoman, she understood the Roman Curia, the papal court, better than anyone in the family. She took on the role of his guide and protector in Rome. Clarice was deeply pious, and she worried about the effect the famously decadent Roman court would have on the young cardinal. Her letters to Lorenzo are full of concern for Giovanni's spiritual well-being, but she was also a pragmatist. She knew what was required. She taught him how to behave, who to trust, and how to survive in a city of intrigue. She acted as his hostess, his banker, and his political advisor. She was continuing the work that Lucrezia had started. When Giovanni was elected Pope in 1513, taking the name Leo X, it was the culmination of decades of Medici planning. He was the first Medici Pope. His papacy was famous for its lavish spending on art and architecture. He patronized Raphael and began the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. He famously said, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." This was the Medici style brought to the Vatican, but this success created a new challenge. Now the Medici had to produce another pope. The family's ambitions focused on Giulio de Medici, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother, Giuliano. After Giuliano was assassinated, Lorenzo raised Giulio in his own household. Clarice Orsini acted as a mother to him. He was a serious, intelligent boy, the opposite of his pleasure-loving cousin Giovanni. He also entered the church. When Giovanni became Pope Leo X, he made his cousin Giulio a cardinal and his chief advisor. The two of them ruled the church together. After Leo's death and a brief interlude, Giulio was elected Pope in 1523, taking the name Clement VII. The Medici had done it again, 2 popes in a decade, but Clement's reign was a disaster. He was indecisive, and his political maneuvering backfired spectacularly. His switching of alliances led to the catastrophic sack of Rome in 1527, when the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V overwhelmed the city. It was a moment of profound humiliation for the papacy and for the Medici. The women who raised these boys, Lucrezia and Clarice, had succeeded in the impossible task. They had put their sons on the papal throne, but they had also created men who were perhaps more Medici than they were churchmen. Leo X's spending helped to provoke the Protestant Reformation. Clement VII's political failures led to the sack of Rome and the English Reformation. Raising a son to be a pope was the ultimate Medici power play, but the consequences were far greater than any of them could have imagined. The rule was to achieve power, but it said nothing about what to do with it once you had it. Number 6, can you be a banker and a mother? Contessina de' Bardi was born around 1390. She married Cosimo de' Medici in 1415. For the next 50 years, she was the matriarch of the most powerful banking family in Europe. The Medici Bank had branches in London, Geneva, Avignon, and Bruges. It handled the Pope's finances. It was a vast, complex international business, and while Cosimo was the public face of the bank, Contessina was the manager of its nerve center, the Medici household. The rule for the wife of the head of the Medici Bank was twofold and contradictory. You had to run a household that was also a corporate headquarters and a political hub. And you had to raise the next generation of bankers and leaders. You had to be a CEO and a mother at the same time in a world that did not have a word for what you were doing. The Medici Palace was not just a home, it was a place of business. On any given day, branch managers from other cities might be there, waiting to see Cosimo. Political allies would be in the courtyard, seeking an audience. Artists would be there, hoping for a commission. It was a constant flow of people, all of whom needed to be managed, housed, and fed. Contessina was in charge of all of it. She managed a huge staff of servants, clerks, and tutors. She oversaw the accounts for the household, which was a significant expense. Her letters show her deep involvement in the family's affairs. She wasn't just ordering food for the kitchen. She was involved in real estate. She and Cosimo would discuss the purchase of farms and villas, which were not just country retreats, but also important agricultural investments. She advised on the management of these properties. She had a reputation for being careful with money, a good quality and a banker's wife. At the same time, she was raising her sons, Piero and Giovanni. This was not just about making sure they learned their lessons. It was about grooming them to take over the family business. She would have been responsible for their early education, for instilling in them the values of the family: prudence, discretion, and loyalty. She had to teach them how to behave in a way that would not alienate the fiercely Republican Florentines. The Medici's power was unofficial. It depended on maintaining the image of being ordinary citizens, even though they were not. And Contessina, with her old Florentine family background, understood this perfectly. Her biggest test came in 1433, when Cosimo was arrested and then exiled from Florence by a rival faction. As Contessina was left behind in the city, she was alone in a hostile environment with her children. Her role now was to protect the family's assets in Florence and to act as a communication hub for Cosimo's supporters. It was a dangerous position. She had to be discreet and courageous. She managed to hold things together until Cosimo made his triumphant return a year later. She outlived her husband and both of her sons. In her old age, she lived in the household of her grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent. She was the respected elder, the living link to the family's past. She had seen the Medici go from being one of several powerful families to being the undisputed leaders of Florence. Her contribution was not in making the big deals or setting the political strategy. It was in the vital daily work of maintaining the infrastructure of power. She managed the home that was a bank, and she raised the sons who would inherit it. The rule was to be both a mother and a banker, and Contessina de' Bardi showed that it was not only possible but essential to the family's success. Number 5. Can you speak your own mind? For a Medici woman, a strong opinion was a dangerous thing. In the world of Renaissance politics, words were weapons. A careless comment could offend a powerful ally. A public disagreement with your husband could undermine his authority. A personal preference could be interpreted as a political statement. The rule was clear: be educated, be intelligent, be charming. But keep your true thoughts to yourself. Your opinions are not your own. They belong to your family. This was a lesson that every Medici woman had to learn. Their letters are often models of discretion. They are filled with polite formulas, careful phrasing, and a constant awareness that they could be read by others. When they wanted to express a strong opinion, they often did it indirectly, by quoting someone else or by framing it as a humble suggestion. Lucrezia Tornabuoni was a master of this. She was a poet and a writer, a woman with a rich intellectual life. But in her political dealings, she was always careful. She would advise her son Lorenzo, but she would do it in private. In public, she was the dutiful mother, the pious patron of convents. She created a public persona that masked her sharp political mind. The danger of speaking one's mind is most clearly seen in the case of women who were not as skilled as Lucrezia or who came from a different culture. Clarice Orsini, Lorenzo's Roman wife, never quite learned this lesson. She was used to the more direct, hierarchical society of Rome. She would state her opinions plainly, which the Florentines found jarring and arrogant. Her open disagreement with her son's humanist tutor Poliziano caused a major scandal in the household. Her criticism of Lorenzo's friends and allies caused political headaches for her husband. She wasn't being malicious. She was just being herself, but in the Medici world, being yourself was a luxury you couldn't afford. The ultimate example of a Medici woman who spoke her mind and paid the price is Marie de Medici. As regent of France, she was in a position of supreme power. She did not have to hide her opinions. She openly favored her Italian advisors. She pursued a pro-Spanish foreign policy that many in the French court disagreed with. She made no secret of her dislike for her husband's old ministers, and later she openly challenged her own son and his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Her frankness was her undoing. It alienated the French nobility. It gave her enemies ammunition. It made her seem like a foreign tyrant who did not understand the French way of doing things. When she confronted her son on the idea of the dupes, she laid her cards on the table. She demanded that he choose. It was a direct, emotional, and ultimately catastrophic move. A more subtle political player might have worked behind the scenes, gradually undermining Richelieu's position. Marie went for a direct assault, and she lost. Her exile was a direct consequence of her refusal to play the game of subtle insinuation and hidden meanings. To speak your mind, you needed to have a power base that was unshakable, but a Medici woman's power was almost always derivative. It came from her father, her husband, or her son. It was not her own, and so her opinions could not be her own either. They had to be a carefully calibrated reflection of the family's interests. The rule was to be a beautiful, intelligent echo. To be the voice itself was a transgression that the system was designed to punish. Number 4, can you escape your family's name? The name Medici was both a shield and a cage. To be born a Medici was to be born into a world of wealth, influence, and opportunity. The name opened doors. It commanded respect and often fear, but it also came with a heavy set of expectations. The name defined you before you had a chance to define yourself. The rule was you are a Medici first, an individual second. Everything you do reflects on the family. You can never escape the name. This was true for the men, but it was even more true for the women. A Medici son could, through his own actions, add to the family's luster or tarnish its reputation. A Medici daughter's role was more passive. She was a carrier of the name. Her marriage was a transaction involving the name. Her children would connect another family to the name. She was a vessel for the family's identity. When Catherine de Medici arrived in France, she was not seen as Catherine. She was the Italian girl, the merchant's daughter, La Médicis. Her name was a constant reminder to the French court that she was not one of them. She was not from an ancient royal line. She was from a family of bankers who had bought their way into power. For her entire life, her enemies used her name against her. They accused her of bringing Italian poisons, Italian plots, and Italian decadence to the French court. Even when she was the most powerful person in France, she could not escape the stigma of her origins. The name also meant that you were a target. The Medici had many enemies. In 1478, the Pazzi conspiracy attempted to wipe out the family. Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother, Giuliano, was murdered in the Florence cathedral. Lorenzo himself barely escaped. The women of the family, like Lucrezia Tornabuoni and Clarice Orsini, were left to deal with the terrifying aftermath. They had to secure the palace, protect the children, and wait to see if their world would collapse. Their name made them participants in a political drama that could turn deadly at any moment. Even if a Medici woman married into a powerful family in another city or country, she was still a Medici. She was expected to act as an agent for her birth family. Her new husband and his family knew this. It could create a constant tension, a question of divided loyalties. Was she loyal to her husband or to her father and brothers in Florence? The only way to escape the name was to enter a convent. This was the path for some Medici women, particularly those who were not needed for a strategic marriage. By becoming a bride of Christ, a woman could leave the world of dynastic politics behind, but even then the family's influence followed them. A Medici nun would likely become the abbess of her convent. The family would be a major patron of the convent, funding building projects and art commissions. Even in the cloister, the name mattered. For a woman like Anna Maria Luisa de Medici, the last of the line, the name was her entire identity. Her life's work was the preservation of the Medici legacy. She could not escape it because she was it. Her final act, the family pact, was a recognition that while her own life was ending, the name Medici had to be preserved for eternity, attached to the art and the city that the family had shaped. The rule was that the name was bigger than you were. It was your defining feature, your greatest asset, and your heaviest burden. And there was no way to set it down. Number 3, can you be forgiven for being a woman? In the world of the Medici, power was a male currency. It was held by men, passed down through men, and exercised by men. The entire structure of society, from the laws of inheritance to the customs of business and politics, was built on this foundation. For a Medici woman, her gender was the most fundamental, unchangeable fact of her existence, and in the context of power, it was a liability. The unspoken rule was this: you must constantly overcome the perceived weakness of your gender. You will not be forgiven for being a woman. This meant that a Medici woman had to be twice as clever, twice as discreet, and twice as tough as a man in a similar position to achieve half the recognition. If a Medici man was a patron of the arts, he was a connoisseur. If a Medici woman was a patron, she was being extravagant. If a man was a tough negotiator, he was shrewd. If a woman was a tough negotiator, she was a shrew. Look at Catherine de Medici. She ruled France as regent for her sons for decades. She navigated the treacherous waters of the religious wars. She held the country together by sheer force of will. A king who had done the same might have been called the Great. Catherine was called the Serpent Queen. She was accused of using poison, of consulting astrologers and sorcerers, of being a manipulative Italian schemer. Her methods were no more ruthless than those of many male rulers of her time, including her father-in-law, King Francis I, or her contemporary Philip II of Spain. But her actions were viewed through the lens of her gender. She was seen as unnatural. A woman should not have that much power. A woman who did must have gotten it through dark and illegitimate means. This prejudice was deeply ingrained. When Lucrezia Tornabuoni advised her son Lorenzo, she had to do it from the shadows because for a man to be seen taking political advice from his mother would have undermined his authority. When Caterina Sforza defended her fortress, her defiance was so shocking precisely because she was a woman. She was acting like a man, and this was both admired and feared. The entire system was designed to contain female power. A woman could not inherit the family's main titles or fortune. Her power was temporary. It was valid only as long as she was acting on behalf of a male relative, her husband, her son, her brother. And a widow like Anna Maria Luisa de Medici had power because she was the last of her line, the sole inheritor of the family property, but she could not pass it on. With her, it ended. This reality shaped everything. It shaped their education, which was designed to make them good wives and mothers, not rulers. It shaped their legal rights, which were minimal. It shaped their public roles, which were largely ceremonial. To achieve anything more, a Medici woman had to work around the system. She had to use influence instead of authority. She had to be a master of soft power. She had to persuade, cajole, and manipulate because she could not command. The rule was that your gender was a disadvantage. You could never fully erase. You could be brilliant, like Lucrezia Tornabuoni. You could be brave, like Caterina Sforza. You could be a survivor, like Catherine de Medici. But you would always be judged by a different standard. Your successes would be minimized, and your failures would be blamed on the fact that you were, after all, just a woman. It was the most impossible rule of all, because it was a rule they could do nothing to change. Number 2, can you ever truly be loyal? A Medici woman lived a life of divided loyalty. From the moment she was born, she was taught that her first and only duty was to her family, the Medici. But then she was married off to another family, often in another city or another country. At that point, her duty was supposed to shift. She was now a wife and a mother in a new lineage. She was expected to be loyal to her husband and to her new family. The unspoken Medici rule, however, was that her true loyalty must always remain with the family of her birth. This created an impossible conflict that defined her entire existence. When a Medici daughter married a French prince or a Roman nobleman, she was not just a bride. She was a diplomat, an ambassador, and a spy. She was expected to send a constant stream of information back to Florence. She was expected to use her influence at her new court to benefit Medici political and business interests. Her father and brothers would write to her with instructions, asking her to put in a good word for a Medici ally, to lobby for a favorable trade deal, or to gather intelligence about her new family's plans. This put her in an incredibly difficult position. If she was too obviously a Medici agent, she would be distrusted by her new family. Her husband might see her as a foreign mole in his own bed. The court would shun her as an outsider. But if she truly assimilated and became loyal to her new family, she would be betraying the family that raised her. She would be failing in her primary duty. Catherine de Medici lived this contradiction for her entire life in France. When she first arrived, she was a Medici in a French court that was often hostile to her family's interests. She had to tread carefully. Later, as queen and regent, her primary goal became the preservation of the French monarchy for her sons. In this, her interests and the interests of France were aligned, but she still relied on Italian advisors. She still arranged strategic marriages for children, just as her own had been arranged. She was always seen as something of an outsider, a woman whose ultimate loyalties were suspect. The reverse was also true. A woman who married into the Medici family was expected to become a Medici. But she was never fully trusted. Clarice Orsini was Lorenzo's wife and the mother of his heir, but her Roman ways, her Roman piety, and her Roman family connections were always a source of mild suspicion in Florence. She was never quite one of them. Her loyalty was to her husband, but her heart, many suspected, remained in Rome. This tension was at the heart of the dynastic system. Marriages were about creating alliances, but they were also about placing your people in the enemy's camp. A woman was the human embodiment of that alliance, and she was also the potential weak point. Her personal feelings had to be suppressed in favor of this complex political game. Could she be loyal to her husband and love him, while also sending reports on his political dealings back to her brother? Could she raise her children to be princes of their own country while also teaching them to favor their Medici relatives? The answer was that she had to try to do both. She had to live a double life. Her loyalty was a performance, a constant balancing act. She had to appear to be completely devoted to her new family while never forgetting where she came from. The rule was to be loyal to everyone, which in the end meant that you could never be truly loyal to anyone but the idea of the family itself. It was a lonely and precarious existence. Number one, can you win a game you were designed to lose? This was the ultimate question for every Medici woman. The game was power. The board was Renaissance Europe. The pieces were armies, banks, and titles. The game was designed by men for men. The rules were written by men. And a woman was, by design, not a player. She was a piece. She was a valuable queen, perhaps, to be moved across the board to secure a strategic advantage. Or maybe she was a pawn to be sacrificed for a greater gain. But she was never supposed to be the one deciding the moves. So could you win? Could you, as a piece on the board, somehow take control of the game? The 15 rules we have looked at are really just descriptions of the game's mechanics. You can't choose your husband, you can't own property, you can't speak your mind, you can't command an army. Your loyalty is always divided. Your gender is always a handicap. Every rule was a constraint, a wall, a limitation designed to keep a woman in her place. And yet, some of them won. Not by breaking the rules, which was almost always a path to ruin, like for Marie de Medici, but by mastering them, by understanding the rules so perfectly that they could bend them to their will. Lucrezia Tornabuoni won. She accepted the rule that she could not be smarter than her husband in public. So she built her own power base in private. She used the female tasks of charity and household management to create a vast political network that her son Lorenzo inherited and used to rule Florence. She won by turning a limitation into a strength. Catherine de Medici, in many ways, won. She was sent to France as a pawn in a papal game. She was ignored by her husband. She was despised as a foreigner. She was supposed to produce heirs and then fade into the background. But she outlived her husband and all her rivals. She ruled a kingdom through 3 of her sons. The kingdom was a wreck, and her sons were a tragedy, but she held on. She played the game as a woman for 30 years at the highest level. In a game designed for her to be a passive piece, she became the most active player on the board. Her survival was a victory, and Anna Maria Luisa de Medici won perhaps most completely of all. She was the last piece on the board. The game was over. The dynasty was finished. By the rules, she was supposed to simply fade away. But she made one last move, a move no one expected. With the family pact, she changed the goal of the game. It was no longer about bloodlines and power. It was about legacy and art, By giving everything away, she secured the Medici name forever. She couldn't win the old game, so she created a new one and wrote a single final rule that made her the winner. The lives of these women were a constant struggle against the confines of their world. They were born into a system that was fundamentally rigged against them. They were told what to do, who to marry, and what to think. Most had no choice but to accept their fate. But a few, the most remarkable ones, found a way to play the hand they were dealt with breathtaking skill. They could not win the game as it was designed. No woman could. But by being smarter, more resilient, and more creative than the men who made the rules, they managed to change the game itself. And that was the only victory that ever truly mattered.